Hello and welcome to the Inside Intelligence event series, brought to you by the Johns Hopkins University Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program and the Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features Jack O'Connor, Program Director of the Master of Science in Geospatial-Intelligence program, and Michael Ard, Program Director of the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program, discussing the conflict in Ukraine, the Geospatial-Intelligence Perspective. My name is Peter Huggins, and I'm the event producer. Please note today's program will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the MS in Intelligence Analysis playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function, and we will answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the event to the host of our program, Michael Ard.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome everyone today to this special Ides of March edition of Inside Intelligence. Unlike past conflicts, much of the buildup to this war in Ukraine and then Russia's attack has been told by images provided by geospatial intelligence. We have seen published in the media satellite photographs of Russian troops massing on the border and long columns of tanks advancing in the Ukrainian countryside. Most of these images have come from commercial satellites. Geospatial intelligence has been around for a long time, but rarely has the public had this kind of routine exposure to it. Some of the questions we want to ask are, how do we interpret this extraordinary form of intelligence? What are its strengths and limitations? What should we be looking for from geospatial intelligence as this tragic conflict proceeds? So with us today to explain it all is Jack O'Connor, the director of the MS in Geospatial Intelligence program at Johns Hopkins AAP. Jack was the founder and the first director of the program back in 2018. He has practiced, led, taught, and written about geospatial intelligence. A former CIA officer, he managed and led analytic and support organizations focused on combat support, national intelligence, diplomatic initiatives, and disaster support missions, as well as regional, functional, environmental, economic, and social analysis in CIA's National Photographic Interpretation Center and in the Defense Department, in the National Imagery and Mapping Agency, and the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency. Jack, I'd like to turn it over to you. I think you have a presentation for us.
Thank you, Michael. I do. And I think that should be visible now. My thanks for your attention, and I'll spend maybe 10 to 15 minutes going through a series of slides and comments about geospatial intelligence, and specifically as we're using it to look at the war in Ukraine. And then I'm happy to take comments and questions afterwards. So, to start with a common base, this is a map of the Ukraine, and I'll be talking about two specific places in particular. Vinnytsia airfield, sort of in the center western part of the country, and then Rivne, used to be called Rovno airfield, up in the northwest part of the country. But to get a sense of scale, Ukraine is about 85% of the size of Texas. So that if you were to take a piece of Texas off about the size of Indiana, what would be left would be a match for the size of the Ukraine. Now, it's considerably north. The northernmost part of Ukraine is, or the northernmost part of the Ukraine is roughly at the same longitude as Edmonton, Canada, and the southern part is at the same as Bangor, Maine, to give you a sense of orientation. And it matters because an area that size presents some challenges for covering with geospatial intelligence. And you try to imagine looking at 85% of the state of Texas on a given day. So, but here's an area that has been in the news very recently, mostly because of two strikes at its airport. And I want to talk a little bit about this. This is a Maxar image, which is what Google Earth uses most frequently. And Maxar is important because it's one of the commercial companies that emphasizes very high resolution. And its satellites are larger, 4,000 to 5,000 pounds each, in comparison to some satellites, which weigh about 160 pounds. And there are even smaller satellites that Planet uses in its Dove series that weigh about 15 pounds. But anyway, this the point I want to make, and is if you look over to the right-hand bottom of the side, this is the airport. And there's a curved road leading to the center, and then another road that bears off towards the top of the image. If you remember those two roads, it'll be helpful because of the next slide, which is somewhat different from lots of the commercial imagery you may have seen. This is the first time that a particular kind of sensor called synthetic aperture radar is being used in a large commercial sense. The virtue of radar matters in the Ukraine because very frequently it's cloud-covered area in the springtime, and also radar goes through clouds and radar works at night. And here's that curved road that I mentioned, and the other road going sort of straight into the middle of the airfield. But this little area in the circle looks as though someone smeared an eraser on the dark line. And that is takes a little interpretation to learn how to look at SAR radar. Basically, it's beams energy at the Earth and it then catches the beam as it bounces back. And the metal in particular, like this light-toned area here, that's an aircraft, that will reflect the beams differently. But if a surface is disturbed and the energy bounces differently from the adjacent energy of the flat runway, it will look a little blurry. And that blur is in fact where the Russians put a precision-guided rocket into the middle of the airfield and turned the airfield from a 2,500 meter airfield to a 1,600 meter runway. And it's important because the image was taken at nearly 1:30 in the morning. So the imagery of the Ukraine can be taken day and night, and as you will see later, almost around the clock. So, and the fascinating technological development with small sats is this satellite was launched in the year 2020, and the earlier European radar satellite launched in 2014 is much heavier than this. So you can launch essentially 10 of the new smaller kinds of satellites for the same energy that it took to take one Sentinel up into space. So, now here's what a value of geospatial imagery is. At a later date, the 6th of March, the Russians attacked Vinnytsia again. And this is a screen grab from the Guardian story. But part of the problem is this is much more dramatic than looking at a black and white SAR image, but there's no scale or context or exact location. We know we're looking at something burning, but from the image, you can't tell if it's the fuel tank, an aircraft, the administration building, a hangar, or something else. So the media can get the advantage of some scaling information and some visual context from commercial imagery. And that's very often how they're using it. Now they can use it day and or night. The second airfield that I want to talk a little bit about, and this isn't about airfields, but it's about one of the differences in what geospatial information can do, because geospatial intelligence really deals with the future. And as best as I've been able to discover, and I was a little nervous this morning, but I haven't found anything new other than a story about a geospatial provider now starting to pay attention to RIVNI. But there has been, as best as we can tell, no Russian activity in RIVNI. But I want to point out a couple of things on the image. RIVNI is important because this line through here in the middle is a very large rail yard. And this is the railroad junction for essentially the Western Ukraine, where most of the traffic comes in. And railroads and airfields are important not because they are weapons, but because they allow logistics to happen. They allow the transfer of people and weapons and the movement. And military organizations have to pay attention to logistical structures, logistical infrastructure. If you remember the famous quote from General Russell Honore during Hurricane Katrina, when a reporter asked him what his strategy was, the response went, amateurs talk tactics, rank amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. Because one of the challenges and one of the unknowns is how are the Ukrainians going to support themselves logistically? And also, what are the Russian difficulties in moving men and equipment with their logistical support? So knowing that in advance allows an analyst to sort of say, what areas do I think will matter in the future? And that's the purpose of intelligence, to be able to answer future questions and to be able to sort of say, we see these changes and we believe they portend this, or that we don't see something we expected to see. And therefore we've stopped thinking that this is a possible or potential outcome. Now I'll go back to the airfield, which is in Rivne down here in the bottom left of the image. And I'll talk a little bit about the detail that sometimes goes into the training of professional geospatial analysts. Here's two images, and one is a piece of the runway at Venezia, and the other is a piece of the runway at Rivne. And if you notice, they're essentially concrete rectangles. And both runways share the fact that there are 6 rectangles in width. And this is something that analysts look for: shape, symmetry, and also repeated patterns. Both of these, now they're airports. They used to be Soviet fighter air bases. And the Soviet Union built following a pattern. And why it has these very large concrete blocks is the ground heaving in the very northern latitudes means you sometimes have to at the spring, after the winter's heaved up your runway, you may have to readjust it. And so they essentially go out and realign the blocks. So it's a feature of how they constructed the areas. It also points out some historical context, which is the Russians know the Ukrainian infrastructure every bit as well as the Ukrainians know the Ukrainian infrastructure, because they built quite a bit of it, particularly the military infrastructure. It also is a challenge for looking at combat activity. Both forces use very much the same equipment. Their armored vehicles, their artillery, their transport, their aircraft are very much look alike. So everything ground analysts in peacetime have kind of an easier challenge when the equipment is all parked in nice neat rows inside garrisons. But when it deploys into an urban or a forested area, sorting out which unit is which and where it came from and where it's likely to go is a much more challenging analytic task. So, but the basis for lots of the work starts in the recognition of details in the classic photo interpreter's recognition of size, shape, shadow, symmetry, similarity, surroundings. So. But it's a different world now, and I'll start to switch to talk a little bit about that. Here are the considerations for a geospatial collection. And if any of you want to do this yourself, I'll give you a key to do it later in the briefing. However, the message is important. Bring your wallet, and I hope you're carrying a big wallet, because this is not a cheap process currently. But if you're thinking about collection, you need to think about something called swath width, or how much area of the Earth will the image cover. And very high resolution sensors often cover smaller areas than lower resolution sensors. Resolution is how much detail can you see in the image. It's easy to see the scenes among the 6 blocks in the runway, but could you see parts of the plane and identify is it one variant or another of a certain kind of aircraft? You would need higher resolution to be able to answer those questions. Another important consideration is frequency. How many times do I need to look at the same place? One way of thinking about geospatial collection is as a statistical sampling. If I'm building a dam, I can reasonably assume that I don't need to look at it more frequently than 3 times a year. It takes years to build a dam. Whereas if someone was building an airport, I probably want to look at it every couple of weeks to measure how much it has changed, because the changes will be observable over time. Another consideration is the sensor. Can it answer the questions? And the questions often fall into 3 buckets. Initial discovery, where is something or what is something? And then comprehension questions are when you have found something, how well do I understand it? Can I get to the point where I can describe how it works and why it's here and why it's not somewhere else? That's and then finally the questions of tracking, which is what's the sampling I need to follow a moving set of events. In the 80s, first tracking challenge was Soviet mobile missiles, and ironically, there used to be a Soviet missile base in Venezia, and trying to follow those missiles around was the first tracking challenge. And then in the Gulf War, we had a tracking challenge with the Scud missiles. And then most recently, we've gotten to the point where can we track human beings, and tracking Osama bin Laden is one of the uses that, that geospatial contributed to and made some difference in. Another consideration is time of collection, in that if an enemy knows that he's being surveilled, they will often try to move in the gaps between collection coverage. That used to be much easier than it is now, thanks to commercial imagery, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Also, another consideration is every collector can tell you what time they can take a picture tomorrow, but the length of time that it will take that image or the image data to get to the analyst's desk varies with company to company. And essentially, the companies, if you want it faster, instead of going to the postal service, you pay the FedEx fee. You can arrange to get data faster. And the last 2 considerations I mentioned is cost. These are all commercial entities or governments that will sell their data. And then there's the other challenge, which is the economics of attention, which has changed in this profession. It used to be that images were scarce. And so there was a lot of fighting over who got the scarce resource. Images now are plentiful, and the scarce resource is analytic time to look at them. And talk a little bit about that. For those of you who are interested, this is a website, and it's in Greenbelt, Maryland, this company. And you can punch in coordinates and then see what satellites have access to what coordinates at a given time. And yesterday afternoon, when I was preparing this, I punched in the coordinates for Livni. And I got 12 hours worth of information that told me I would have 126 different satellite accesses in the 12 hours. And the satellites that would give me the access were flown by 24 countries. And I've listed them there because the small sat and imaging phenomenon has gone global. And this is really a development in the last 10 years or so. And countries, it reminds me of the phenomenon that after World War II, every country needed a national airline. And so there was a proliferation of mostly government subsidized national airlines. Well, now it seems that every country needs a geospatial collection system. And there is a proliferation of sponsored geospatial collection systems. Just to give you an idea, anywhere that's blue flies satellites. And most of the world is blue, and it's getting bluer and bluer. I think they're up to 76 countries now that have programs. And some of them I kind of wonder at. Mauritius has a geospatial intelligence program. It would take a satellite would be over Mauritius for literally seconds out of a whole day. And I wonder what they do with the rest of the day and what they look at. But they felt the need to have a program. Mauritius is this little island here off the African coast. So, But anyway, this is the point about it being harder to hide. I looked and measured the intervals among the satellites yesterday, and a lot of them fly in clusters. They were less than a minute apart, and that's mostly due to the Planet constellation. Because Planet flies its satellite, and you can think of sort of the World War II movies, they fly in formation. So they fly very close to each other and essentially work as a push broom crossing. And this is because their corporate strength is the amount of area. Planet can look at the Earth every day, all the land masses. So it takes a lot of small satellites, but they fly close together at certain times. And then other satellites have different gaps. But if you can see that the longest, there was one 79-minute gap in the 12 hours of yesterday. Most of the gaps were under half an hour. And if you're trying to move a unit, a ground forces unit, you've got a very limited time before, if you were trying to do this at Ribney yesterday, before you would be seen. And that's changed the nature of some combat things. But what all this collection also has really allowed are some things that used to work in the former activities that no longer work as well now. Independently, geospatial intelligence can corroborate or rebut other media sources. So the Ukrainians can make statements and the Russians can make statements, but really the whole Earth can look to see, is there any evidence for the truth or the falsity of the statements they've made? The second is something the media is just discovering, which is it's risky to put reporters in some places, but you can put satellites there and minimize the risk. So ideally, I think media organizations will need to start thinking a little bit like intelligence officers to think at, we're only seeing this here on the ground. We might want to look somewhere else to see, are there activities going on that it would be preparations for movement or for something else on both sides. One other virtue is it's very difficult to deny access to a satellite. You can try to do some things underground, but now there are some of the SAR satellites have the ability to detect subsidence. So they can tell if someone is altering the surface of an area. And one of the important considerations for geospatial intelligence is it can provide indications of future activities that helps decision makers act or differently, which allows them some decision advantage in planning for the future.
Now, thank you, Jack. I mean, that really gives us a much deeper understanding, I think, of how the geospatial intelligence has been used in this. What are some of the other areas that we've been seeing where it could be, where it could really be to our advantage to be looking? I mean, you talked about logistics, but there's so many aspects to this conflict now, including the flow of people. How effective would GeoInt be in tracking that? Mute. You're still on mute, Jack.
I'm sorry, Michael, that's a really fine question, and it's a traditional use. It has surprised me that there haven't been media organizations looking over the borders and seeing what is the size of the camps in Romania, Poland, and Hungary. Also, the extent of, there was some imagery showing lines of cars at the border. But the challenge there, and the most famous image so far, I think, of this conflict is the 40-mile military convoy. But once you've seen that it's there, then you can monitor that it's still there. It's not much of a dynamic story. Eventually, it may matter when it moves and where it moves to, or if it can't move. But the movement of people is one of the areas that you can monitor. There will be, depending on what happens in the country, movement out of the areas. Now what's fascinating to me also, I saw something today, the Ukrainian head of their space industries, and they're centered over towards the east, near Dnipro and Kharkov, and over near, and between Kharkov and Kiev, they are trying to preserve their infrastructure, and the Russians so far haven't destroyed it either, because both of these countries have invested heavily in geospatial intelligence. The Romanians have put out an appeal to all these countries that are saying, if anyone has geospatial information, intelligence about Ukraine, would you send it to us? And immediately South Korea said, we don't have any. And one of the reasons I believe that was their response is there are South Korean satellites in Kazakhstan at Baikonur, which is the old site of Tyuratam. And the Soviet Union has made a lot of money off of space launches, and they're holding some South Korean satellites. And the feeling was that the South Koreans shared the data, Russians might not be so willing to launch their satellites. So it's a conflict that is different than those before. And one other area I haven't talked about yet is both sides are using reconnaissance drones. And I know for sure the Ukrainians are using combat equipped drones, essentially to drop precision weapons. One drone acts as the spotter and the other carries the weapon. But drones allow you surveillance or looking over time. And then they're really effective tracking tools if you're trying to answer tracking questions. And really good intelligence organizations will have some combination of satellite and drone collection strategies. So.
Thanks. And by the way, I'll remind everyone, we're taking questions. You can put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll be delighted to get to them. Another thing, Jack, to think of, and we're trying to, as we think more broadly about the impact of this war, is the environmental impact, right? Sure. And what geospatial intelligence could possibly do for help us assess what's happening there.
Yes, that's a traditional use of remote sensing, and having looked at areas over time sometimes provides knowledge. One of the interesting parts in the Balkans War was the United States went in, and we went in our usual approach. We wanted to start peacekeeping and set up a humanitarian area. And we had to tell the command that the area you've chosen is right next to a tailings pond from a mine. And the tailings pond was essentially full of sulfuric acid and lots of other chemicals that you don't want to have people around. But having looked at that part of the country for years during the old Soviet Warsaw Pact area, we knew where the dangerous facilities were and where there were potential environmental hazards. Russia and the Soviet Union before him have horrible environmental records. They basically trashed everywhere they lived. And so there are lots of areas where after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Eastern European countries asked the US for help in identifying areas where the Russians dumped fuel into lakes and lots of other areas. And then start with the environmental cleanup. So the damage, both physical to the state and also functional, as we saw the Russians hit Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia. Well, if they ever hit them effectively, they could have radioactive waste leaks. And that would be something that geospatial intelligence would be essential in sort of figuring out where is it, what's the extent of it, where do the prevailing winds take this, and what areas do we need to think about? So.
Right, thanks. One other question is just, we know the Russians have pretty good electronic warfare capability. This is something they've invested a lot in. How effective is jamming of these type of satellites or jamming of, say, GPS systems that might impact this type of collection?
Now, the Russians have been doing some jamming, and actually a commercial company, Hawkeye 360, has detected them. And they are trying to basically jammed the Ukrainians' ability to use precise weapons. But they're pretty ham-handed in one respect, which is it's very easy to identify when they're trying it. And also, there's been some press reporting about some of the challenges the Russians are having with their locational equipment. They have tried to build, I believe it's a GLONASS, their version of a GPS, and some of the precision, they had some struggles with it, and there were some units caught using Google Maps to navigate around the Ukraine, some Russian units. So they have, you can jam drones effectively. You can't jam satellites effectively.
All right, right, good, thanks. Let's get to some questions now. There's a lot of things this is to ask about this fruitful discussion here. One question is, do we think the Russians are paying attention to the commercial satellites too and exploiting it?
I believe they are, because they've been flying imaging satellites since 1961 or 2, right after the US started. And now their technology was behind all of us for a very an interesting cultural reason. We flew film return satellites from 1960 through 1984. And essentially, they were the world's most expensive disposable cameras, because we used them once, we captured the film, we threw the camera into the ocean. Whereas the Russians recycled their cameras. They would bring back the camera and the film, but their cameras didn't develop in as quickly as US photo and chemical technology. And so they've been sort of technically behind in some of their imaging capabilities for most of that time. But that said, they used to have, the Soviet Union had a satellite warning system, which essentially told their forces, don't be outside between these times because the US can be watching you. So they've been aware of trying to use deception and denial, their word for it, maskirovka, in terms of hiding what they were doing in preparation for military activity. But it's much harder than it used to be. One of the things in their thinking, I'm sure, that they didn't plan on, oh, we might be caught by the Peruvians, because Peru had an imaging satellite over the Ukraine yesterday. I don't know what they imaged, but they could have imaged Rivne if they wanted to. So it's a harder game with all the commercial developments.
And Mauritius is on its way. I mean,
yes, Mauritius could be
they're the next one. Okay, another question is, you mentioned about the time of delivery to analysts. How do commercial satellites get the imagery to analysts, and what is the delay? Can they do this in real time?
Well, you can do it in what's called near real time, because you need a link to wherever your ground station is. And let's just say the orbit for most of these is in the range of 90 minutes. And any spot on the Earth really is you can only image it for about an 8-minute window. So if you're over the Ukraine, you have to go around the planet until you have a line of sight to your ground station. And if your ground station was in Norway, then you have to go most of the way around the Earth to get back to Norway. If your ground station was in Italy, you may have to go a short time. It really depends on the company. Lots of these commercial vendors have multiple ground stations in different locations to accelerate the data receipt. And the Europeans actually have adopted something that was just declassified in the US, which is the use of relay satellites. So instead of trying to shoot your data to a point on the ground, you can send it via another satellite that can see that point on the ground. So.
Another question from Chris. Given your background in combat support, Jack, do you think that this conflict is showing evidence of a lag between conventional military strategy and tactics in adapting to the proliferation of GeoInt and commercial capabilities? will getting real-time GeoInt products in the hands of conventional force commanders on the ground help to level the playing field?
I believe it would, but I don't have any comments on it because all I've talked about are the commercial satellites.
Right.
So in addition to whatever number of orbits they had over the Ukraine yesterday, the Russian, Chinese, and US satellites that are classified also had more orbits. And so that may have cut the windows for activity even closer. And I don't know the extent to which, I mean, the Ukrainians have been asking for geospatial data, but I don't know the extent to which they're using it.
Reading that they've been collaborating with some commercial firms on this.
Sure.
Right. Another question from Matt. We've seen a proliferation of geospatial analysis from amateur OSINT practitioners throughout this conflict. Do you think the quality of geospatial imagery available to the general public is approaching the quality available to major intelligence agencies?
I don't know. I know the technology is getting much better in terms of many of these small sats do lots of onboard processing of the imagery and then send some of it, and the rest of the processing is done on the ground. And that technology, because of the small size and the fact that they can, they don't build large satellites that they need to keep in space for 7 years to get their money back. The cycle time for improvement is shorter and shorter. Things that I hadn't thought of until I started reading about it, cell phone technology is one of the things that really has improved. The camera quality on cell phones, that's going right up into space. And a lot of the processing capabilities for cell phones is what's behind the small sat phenomenon. All of the sensors run into the laws of physics in that one of the challenges, for instance, is you need a certain amount of light to get your sensor to work. And in some areas, that's easier than others. The Ukraine used to be a more difficult area because it's frequently cloud covered. Also, it's so north on the planet that for part of the year, there's very little light. So the day shrinks to a shorter in the winter daytime, and it's also, you get longer light in the summer. And I don't know, I haven't heard any evidence, but I wondered if that was part of the reason for the timing of the invasion, because they're moving towards the longer days.
Right.
But I thought of that more in terms of night fighting capability than imaging capability.
Right. There was a lot of debate before this was happening about whether they would want to wait, right, because of the situation of the roads in Ukraine when it starts getting muddy, right? So anyway, a question here, Jackson, I'm going to ask this part of it. How heavily do you think government professionals now are relying on open source GeoInt?
I don't mean this to sound, it might sound facetious, but more than they used to. But part of the challenge is one, if any of them have a bias towards more classified information, now would be a good time to get rid of that bias, because the number of commercial satellites is increasing far faster than the number of government flown satellites. And but secondly, they're used to, the government basically had built a custom designed infrastructure. So that's designed solely for the purpose of getting data to the analysts as quickly as possible. The other commercial folks don't have that custom designed infrastructure. Now they're trying to ingest commercial imagery into the intelligence community, and the NRO and NGA are working very hard at making that process faster. So I think the trend will be changing, and I think issues now where they have opportunity to augment classified collection with commercial collection. So we'll see how much of that is done and how effectively. Or actually, we may see it. It'll be done in a classified environment.
Thanks. And from Sheila, Would you say the Russians have it, given their investment in satellite, drone technology, et cetera, would you say that they have had an advantage over Ukraine in this conflict in those terms, right? Or is Ukraine able to close the gap, perhaps with Western help and commercial?
Well, the part of the challenge is I think we'll see play out, and it's unknown yet. And I say that because the Russians have a lot of the electronics in their technology are imported. Well, the sanctions essentially have shut a lot of that out. So if they, because in terms of developing their own kinds of microcircuit industry and capability, they weren't any leader in the world, unlike say the US and China, in terms of sophisticated circuitry and electronics. So I'm not sure how long the Russians can sustain what they have from overseas. Now, that said, the Ukrainians have a bigger logistics and sustaining problem because they don't have as big an intelligence structure as the Russians do.
But let's see, Jeremy asks here, we talked about, high resolution images from commercial satellites, but there's been, it's costly. Is there much utility in free moderate resolution imagery from Landsat to analyzing the effects of the war in Ukraine? I think we got John mute here.
Yeah. I think lots of medium and low resolution is being used for certain issues. For instance, one of the things everyone's worried about or will be worried about is what will the effect of this be on wheat production? Ukraine is one of the largest wheat producers. Well, the use of Landsat and other remote sensing satellites for crop vigor studies that's been going on for years, but I think it may matter more now because will this affect the Russian harvest, the Ukrainian harvest, or both? And that'll have an effect on food supplies. Planet imagery is not as high resolution as Maxar, but it is very good for covering large areas and identifying changes over large spaces. For instance, if you had to look at rail infrastructure or highway infrastructure over a large area, you could use, you don't need the highest resolution to do that, and you may go back with higher resolution if you suspect something. But that's another area that looking at how much of the road and rail net is still functional and how well.
Thank you for raising that also about the agricultural output, because that's going to be another area where everybody's going to be very concerned, especially with Ukraine's contribution to world markets and grains. Thank you. Question on the camouflage. I mean, the old days, there was ability to use deception and denial tactics. It's harder now. How effective have the Russians been, or we think they've been, or the Ukrainians been, and what's the big drawback there?
Well, the part of the challenge is that you can, when you're being imaged so frequently, it's how do I have time to set up camouflage or simple concealment, and we saw that's starting to happen when the famous stuck convoy, they started kind of moving into the tree line instead of being parked down the center line of the road. But that's only partial concealment. And analysts were able to see it right away. Because so one of the things, the traditional kinds of concealment and camouflage devices were designed against a single sensor. So it was either designed, you either covered with brush for electro-optical. But on the reflective sensors, however, can pick up the difference between live and dead vegetation. So essentially you're saying, aim weapon here if you rely on that exclusively. There was also camouflage against synthetic aperture radar, where people would try to put up reflectors that did funny things with the radar geometry. But now there is so much of such a variety being flown that it's very hard to camouflage against all the sensors that are coming at you.
I think to summarize Matt's question here, I mean, in terms of what the U.S. could be doing to assist Ukraine on the GeoInt side, I mean, I expect some things like that are happening, but especially on the commercial side, and helping them get a better picture of the battle space.
Well, if that is happening, then I suspect that all the participants will want to keep it relatively quiet until the results can be known. But also the Ukrainians have some experience with geospatial intelligence themselves. And so they may have, I don't know the extent of their indigenous capacity. But I think that the concern that I have is really the duration of the conflict. I'm not sure sort of what will change much, but I believe that the Ukrainians will have a harder time in just sustaining many basics. I think they'll be fine with intelligence, but where will they be getting fuel? Where will they be getting ammunition? Where will they be getting medical supplies? Those are the things that I think, intelligence, you can be looking at areas to see, okay, is there evidence of convoy traffic from Europe into the Ukraine?
Right, and this is something that we really think, where geospatial intelligence would probably be telling us a lot is how these routes are developing. Sure, of course, the Russians are following it too. And, yeah, you mentioned earlier that, professionals talk about logistics, and this is probably increasingly a logistics problem now. Mute there.
I think that both sides are understanding sort of their respective logistics shortcomings. But the Russian military has far more resources. And as I described it, how they sort of wasted wherever they went, they also waste their resources. They don't seem to be worrying about human casualty and medical treatment in the same way that Western militaries do. They seem to learn from their mistakes a little slower in some of the activities now. But that said, that doesn't seem to have stopped the pace and the scale of their activities.
And back to a little bit of the technical side here, and one thing, it's hard to cover in a short period of time, the real impressive technical capabilities that these satellites have these days. But one question that we have is, you can hide equipment, but can you hide? How well can you hide it in tree lines and things like that, which would, in the past, which would have been a very effective means? Is that as effective now?
No, it's not, because you can hide in the tree lines, and that would be really effective against optical or electro-optical sensors. But those big metal objects reflect radar really well, and the trees only impede that partially. So they would essentially be distinguishable. And also, the virtue of all these systems is they provide all the users with GPS precision locations. So if I have an image and it's an hour old, but I'll have precise enough information from that to target from.
A couple more questions. I'd like to talk also, before we finish today, I'd like to talk about a little bit about the profession. And a little bit about the qualities of being a geospatial intelligence analyst. But let's a few more things from our audience. Can you, from Neil, are there circumstances in which you might expect a widespread disruption of overhead imagery?
It would be difficult because you sort of a very large electromagnetic event in space. That would be really what it would take to sort of scramble all the signals. But It used to be that that was isolated to essentially the large powers, the Russians, the Americans, the French, the Chinese, but now the Peruvians are there. And now the Kazakhs are there. So it's much harder to drop everyone's infrastructure than it used to be, because it's distributed globally, and unless it would take a really large systemic capability, and I'm not sure that it would remind me of the effect of Putin took down Facebook, but he didn't take down email. So he's got, you kind of communication in a different venue. You could affect some places with some actions, but it would be very hard to make this go away.
Mitchell asked an interesting question about, okay, how is the Geo Intel being used? So how, for example, do we have a sense of this? How crowdsourced Google Map traffic information is being used to give us an idea of Russian movement, density plots for conflict areas? Yeah.
Sure. One of the things that is, and again, it's by virtue of GPS and GIS technology, cell phone videos and images are registered. You can pull the metadata out of any cell phone, and you'll get a timestamp on it, and you'll get a geocode with it. And so organizations, and the most famous of these is probably Bellingcat, have tracked military movements and down to specific pieces of equipment. And now I often admire the courage of someone standing behind an armed convoy. We're standing beside a road taking pictures of an armed convoy, but people do it. And you can derive tactical information not in real time, but in near real time, and you can digitally communicate it. So some of that is what's going on. And now the Russians have trained or trying to train their 18 and 19-year-old people to please turn off the social media because you're giving away our positions. And so there's a certain amount of electronics discipline required. But the open source information from Google Maps and from terrestrial GeoInt, cell phone videos, but they're time-stamped and geo-registered, so you can make use of that. And I suspect that there are probably informal kinds of electronic lash-ups going on in the Ukraine, where folks are figuring out, hey, we couldn't get information the one way, but we figure out another way to do it.
Everybody, these are great questions. I think we've covered just about everything in the chat. If not directly, indirectly, or Jack has addressed some of these questions about EW. I think we didn't talk about drones. Of course, drones obviously are also a platform. We've been focusing on satellites here mostly, but maybe say a word about how drones are being used and integrated into this picture.
Yeah. Drones can give you two things. One is because their altitude is lower, much higher resolution, but the more important characteristic is their loiter ability. So you can stay in the same place over time, which satellites can't do very effectively. Satellites have to move at the speed they have to move, and otherwise they come out of the sky. And drones, you can program to move from one place to another. You can sort of decide how close you want to be. Whereas with a fixed satellite orbit, the technology's already limited your decision. So drones give you flexibility. They give you better resolution if you need that. But more importantly, their loiter capability means if you know somebody's moving, but you're not sure where, it's possible to surveil them over a period of time and then determine where they're going. That's one of the real technical and tactical advantages of a drone.
I'd like to just, as we start winding down here, and thanks for your attention, everyone, and the great questions. But I think probably a lot of us have been wondering about, okay, so what what makes a geospatial intelligence analyst? What kind of qualities or particular characteristics does one need to be effective at this?
Sure. I would say there are three basic ones. One is the base visual acuity to make distinctions. The second is curiosity in terms of being able to look at an image and why is this thing here and was it here yesterday? And the third is the memory to sort of retain the images to say, this is something I've seen before and I remember I can associate it with something over here. So those three are the sort of the essential characteristics. And the other is because it's not always intuitive for folks looking at images, you really have to develop the communication skills to be able to teach someone how to go through and look at an image and lead them to where you want them, to what it is you want them to see. And so that's, I would say those are the characteristics that are essential. But I've seen some folks do some amazing things, and I never got over the wonder of someone who says, wait a minute, I saw that before. And it was 12 years ago in this place on this date. And I'm thinking, how do they do that? Some of them can.
Yeah, I was just thinking of a friend I had who was an art history major, and one of her characteristics that she said to me, humble bragging, was I never forgot an image. And I thought, as we were talking, what a great geospatial intelligence officer she may have been.
Sure. Well, the first person who drew an aerial map was Leonardo da Vinci in Mola,
right,
in 1503, and he also combined measuring. He walked the streets and measured them, and then was able to draw something that still looks very much like the Google Earth image of Imola today. But having the ability to see a little better than other folks is really useful. So.
And explain it to us laymen.
Yes. Yeah.
What we're looking at, right?
Yes, because
Bobby Kennedy said, right?
Not everyone has that kind of ability to envision. And so lots of analysts have to be able to sort of help the viewer or the person looking see what they're having difficulty seeing themselves. So, and it's as much art as science.
Thank you very much, Jack, for this great presentation today and taking all our questions. And thanks everybody for being such an attentive audience. Look forward to having you back again, Jack. I hope we will have a more chance to talk about this. And for everybody, our next program for Inside Intelligence will be April 6th, where we be another panel discussion and looking at various aspects of the conflict and how it's progressing. And thank you very much for being here with us, and we hope to see you all again soon.